Hello, I'm covering the match between Hikaru Nakamura and Richard Rapport from semifinals of Grand Prix in Berlin. In game 1 we had the Queen's Gambit. Hikaru chose to go for the exchange variation and to play bishop g5 next. Black played c6 to make the center more solid. Queen c2 and now bishop e7. By queen c2 Hikaru tried to stop bishop f5 and now he just continues developing by e3, and now black doesn't want to castle immediately because that would just reveal cards to white. He would be able to use that information to generate some counterplay to black's king. That's why Richard plays more flexible and plays knight bd7, bishop d3, and now knight h5. Rapport delays the castle, also tries to exchange his bad bishop on e7. Hikaru doesn't have any other choice than to capture queen e7, and now white castles on the queen side. And now it becomes more and more likely that black is going to castle on the queen side, because if he doesn't, then he gets under some really dangerous attack on the king side. So that's why knight b6 was played, to get the bishop to e6 and then to castle on the queen side. But first, Hikaru plays h3 to stop bishop g4, so he could have a move like knight f3 next. Rapport plays g6, and now his idea is to go knight g7 and to go bishop f5 next, to exchange this bishop, and to make knight c4 even easier to play. Hikaru plays knight f3, and now knight g7 by Rapport. Tries to go for this exchange, which I mentioned before, but now Hikaru plays g4, trying to stop this. And now a move like h5, which in the perfect case, which is to capture on h5, looks good. Black cannot count on this. White can just play knight e5 and stay solid, defend on g4, and now the knight on e5 is quite strong. Black can never kick this knight from e5 with f6 because g6 is in that case pretty much undefended. So h5 would just make things even worse for black. That's why Rapport plays bishop e6. Now knight e2. The other knight goes to f4. Now Rapport castles, and now king b1, king b8. And now rook c1. He tries to control the c4 square much more. Let's say if black goes knight c4 immediately, then there is also an option of capturing and going knight e5, which would lose the c4 pawn, because there's no b5 since the c6 pawn is under attack. So that's why rook c1 is played to stop knight c4. Now this knight on g7 is quite bad, and it goes to e8 and to d6 to get his knight to c4. Knight f4 by Hikaru, and now knight d6. But now Hikaru plays against this b6 knight, and he plays a4. Now a move like a5 here to stop it would just weaken the pawn, and I think after queen c3 it's quite unpleasant to meet this. a5 pawn hangs, and what can black do? If he goes knight c4 here, there's b3, and knight a3 is quite dangerous, because after king a2 the knight gets stuck on a3. After this, if you capture an a4 like this, then you take on a5, and again, if you want to keep the knight on a4, you need to play b5, but that's also a problem because c6 hangs. So a5 is not so good. Rapport doesn't play a5 here, he plays knight dc4. And now b3 is of course impossible because of this fork. And Hikaru plays a5, he gives up the pawn, but Rapport doesn't capture the pawn right away, he plays queen b4, trying to go for knight a3 next. For example, if he took on a5 in this position, then Hikaru would use the very stranded knight on a5 and play queen c5. And in case of queen c5, dc5, I think knight bc4 is quite risky because black runs a danger of losing the knight. If he goes to d7, then after b4, knight has to go to c4. Then you can capture on c4, and if dc, then you go knight g5. And now the bishop on e6 is under attack. If you try somehow to indirectly attack the f2 pawn by rook df8, then white can take on e6, take and go rook c4. And after e5, knight d3, rook f3, black might have some chances to survive because the f2 pawn is awkward backward. Black might get some chances. The knight is stuck defending the pawn. So he chose a very good response, queen b4. Now Hikaru played queen c3, and now he took on a5. Hikaru takes on a5, knight a5, but now knight g5 is quite tricky. And now the bishop cannot move from e6 because of this fork on f7, but also you have to defend the bishop on e6. Rapport doesn't defend the bishop on e6. He goes for rook df8, trying to indirectly attack the pawn on f2. For example, if he tried to defend by rook d8, I think there is a nice small tactic here, like knight e6, f e6, and then knight h7. And the point is, after this, white gets too many pawns. And for example, in this case, these two pawns on the king side are, I think, too strong, and white can start pushing with g5 and h4, supporting with the rooks, and those two knights on the queen side are too far away, I think. So that's why Rapport chose to play rook df8, giving up the e6 pawn, but relying on attack on f2. Rapport plays this, and now Hikaru plays bishop g6, which is quite a nice tactical blow. Rapport plays knight b3. Although here hg was very interesting, and after knight e6, which was the idea of Hikaru to, in case of this, to have knight g6, to have the same position as before with these two pawns, rook getting to g1. This position would be very nasty for black. But in this position, black doesn't have to capture. If he goes to g8, white goes back because he has to now. f6, and after going back, g5, and after the f6 pawn gets attacked, then you have knight d7, and I think black can hold this pretty comfortably, because black can do something like knight c4, knight d6, get to e4 and attack this pawn on f2. But he went for knight b3, and now knight f e6. Here it was better to capture on h7 first, and in case of rook g8 to save the rook, then just go back to d3, and if he takes king c1, still white is the one who has all the fun because of these two pawns on the king side. And if, let's say, knight d7 to stop knight going to f6, you can take on e6, take, and just go f4. And after this, these pawns seem really scary for white. White can go just g5, g6, knight g5, h4, h5, and it's not so easy for black to organize a defense. He can bring his king to d2 closer and closer to the king side and support these pawns. But he chose to capture like this, fe, and now knight h7. And here I think Rapport missed a chance to complicate things even more. He went for rook fg8. Although he could have taken on f2, and in case of rook c2, there's knight d2, check. And the point is, if king c1, there's knight c4. It's not so clear. Even though white has some pawns on the king side, black can also organize some counterplay, at least with b5, b4, somehow to push these pawns on the queen side. And also, if you need, you can activate with c5 and rook c8 to somehow activate this rook and get some threats. Of course, this is all long term, but I think in the worst case, black has checks on b3 and d2, and I think his chances would be quite good here. But never mind, let's go back to the game. In the game, rook fg8 was played. He took on c1, but now the f2 pawn is not taken. That's the big difference. Now Rapport plays this, but the knight goes back, rook f7, and now g5 by Nakamura. And now he's trying to go for h4, f4, and start pushing the pawns. And now Rapport is rushing too much. He plays rook f6. He gives up some material. I think here rook h4 is the best try, but maybe he was afraid of f4 and getting the king closer and closer to the king side. Maybe now it was time to bring the king closer and closer, and then to sacrifice on f6 and somehow to push these pawns on the queen side. But he chose to capture immediately, and after this, rook f8, now the h pawn starts running, rook f6, and now h5. There's no time for pawn grabbing because white is just going to play h6, let's say. After this, rook f8, here rook h8, there's rook g1 with rook g8 next, so that's not gonna work. So black has to stop it immediately with rook h6, and now the king enters the stage by king d2. And now black's king has to do the same to support his rook. We have a couple of more moves. And now the king got to g4, king got to f6. Now it's time for this rook lift. Basically what white wants is to go rook f3, bishop g6 to enter on f7, and that's why Rapport plays knight c8. And after a couple of more moves, at least now he's stopping the rook f7 entry. But now king g5 happened. It's not easy to propose anything. Now black goes a5, and now white has to be a bit careful, because if he goes rook f6 to be greedy, to attack the e6 pawn, now there's a small tactic here, knight e4, and white is actually losing the exchange. And he plays rook f4 first. He tries to get f3 e4 and then to push e5. For example, if he goes for something like this, there's f3, and then either to go rook f6 with capturing this pawn, or just going e4 and kicking this knight from d6. So that's why Rapport plays knight e4, and now Hikaru took. Here rook e4, and now rook f6. Now black attacks the f2 pawn, so f4 is played, but now black gets at least some counterplay with rook f5. King g4, and now rook b5. He's going to capture the b2 pawn, but the issue is that white has plenty of pawns on the king side. And now he takes on e6, first a4, and now rook e7, king h6, rook e8, and now rook b2. Here he first gives a check, now b5 by Rapport, and now e4. Now it's a race, who is going to be faster? Rook a2 by Rapport, trying to push his b pawn and promote somehow, but Hikaru gives a check, and now they repeat a couple of times. And now he pushes the e pawn. b4 by Rapport, e6, and now b3. It's not so good to play e7 because the e pawn becomes disattached, and I think after rook e2 white would have some issues, because after rook a4 takes here and rook e3, the b pawn still stays alive, and it's much more difficult to realize this. King f5 by Hikaru to support his pawn, and now rook a1. Now he wants to push his b pawn, but he doesn't want to do it immediately, because after that rook b6 is very dangerous, and after this e7, and there's no rook e2 now, without losing the pawn, which is futile. And that's why rook a1 is played, but now rook b6. Now actually he's stopping both of these pawns. So black wants to defend against the e pawn, but now king goes to f6, rook e4, and now e7, time to push the pawn. Rapport takes, king e5, and now rook f1, trying to meet queening with rook e1 skewer, capturing the queen. That's why king d6 is played by Hikaru, and now rook e1 by Rapport. King d7, and now the last chance for Richard, he plays c5. And I think here it was actually much quicker to play d5, and in case of, let's say, c4, to go rook e6, and if he captures d6, and even if black promotes, that's not enough, because after queening, there's queen g6, exchanging queens, and then after e7, the next queen is promoting, and that's game over. But Hikaru chose to capture on c5. We had one more check, king c7, rook e1, king d6, rook d1, king c6, and after this he chose to collect this pawn on b4. And now if you take on e7, then there is rook a4, and after rook e3 there is rook b4, and now the c pawn starts running, king b7 goes, c6, c7, and in the end black has to give up the rook for a pawn. So here Rapport chose to push b2, but after this rook e7, rook a2, things don't change too much. In this position Rapport resigned, because after, let's say, king h6 to at least take this pawn, you can take on a4, king h5, and now just king d6, start pushing this pawn. After rook e1 there's c6, and if black starts giving checks, you can make a bridge by king c5, and after this there's rook c4. And this king is too far away from the pawn. Hikaru was leading, and Rapport had a tough task to beat Hikaru with white. In the game 2, Rapport had to play for a win. He chose an offbeat opening. He chose Reti opening, and after this, bishop g2, Nakamura plays e6, castles, and now bishop e7 by him. And now he doesn't go for d4 and well-known variations like the Catalan. He goes for d3. He tries to play some King's Indian attack stuff. He chose this, and Hikaru castled, knight d2. Nakamura chose to play knight c6. And white had an option of going for e4 and some kind of King's Indian attack with the e5 next, and rook e1, queen e2, and well-known setup with knight f1, bishop f4, h4. You know what I mean. Rapport played something very interesting here. He actually lost the tempo with the following move, and he played d4. He's trying to stop e5, and he's trying to prove that the knight on c6 is much worse than a loss of tempo. There's also a drawback of this move, and that's knight e4, which was played by Nakamura. We'll have some type of stonewall position. Rapport plays c3 and now f5. That's the most principled way to play, because if you play some random move like a6, now there's a danger of knight e4, d4 and knight e5. And now the e4 pawn becomes a real target. Unless you want to play f5 but then you double the c pawns. Or if you want to exchange knights, then the e4 pawn becomes quite weak, and that's a problem. So Hikaru chose to play principally and to play f5. Now Rapport goes to e1, trying to achieve some stonewall position like knight df3, knight d3, and to occupy the e5 square, but in this case it's not so easy because black played e5 now. No, I'm going to play e5 now. And I think here it was a good time to capture on e5, and after this to go for something like knight d3, let's say. And now if the knight goes back, white achieved something. He pushed away the knight from e5. If he takes on d3, then ed, and if you exchange knights, I think that's slightly better for white, because there's always this hole on e5. And it looks like some kind of Petrov, but I think the bishop on g2 is quite good here. And you can double on the e-file, put some pressure with bishop f4, bishop e5. But he chose to keep tension by knight df3. And now Hikaru chose to support the e5 by bishop f6. Also in these types of positions, there are always ideas like g5, g4 to somehow kick this knight away and to make white more passive. And that could be achieved now after this. cd and bishop e6, followed by g5, g4. It looks a bit scary, a bit risky, but that's a good way to deal with such position in the stonewall positions. But bishop f6 is also quite good. Now Rapport plays e3, which is kinda dubious because the bishop stays pretty much dead the whole time. Now Hikaru tries to put his bishop on a6 to put pressure on this diagonal, knight d3, and now rook e8. And again, I think the best choice here was to go for the trade on e5 with this and exchanging dark square bishop. Then go queen c2 and maybe continue with b3, bishop b2. I think that could be quite good for Rapport. But he chose to still keep tension by rook e1, and now bishop a6. And again, there was an option of grabbing on e5, and after all these trades, to go b3. And then bishop b2, eventually putting some pressure along this diagonal, which could be very unpleasant for Hikaru in that case. Just to mention that this is not possible because of queen d4, winning a piece. But in this position, Rapport played bishop h3, and now this allowed black to capture on d3, queen d3, and now queen d7. Let's see the difference between the two positions, this one and this one. Well, in this case, the bishop pair is not so useful, because this bishop on c1 can be opposed by this bishop, Bishop on h3 is opposed by the pawn structure itself, like the f5 pawn, the d5 pawn, and also the knight on e4, which pretty nicely blocks the whole position. So you see how in this case there's less things that can oppose the bishop on b2. There's less obstacles in the position, and that makes white's position much more playable than the one that was in the game after queen d7. And now Rapport tried something, but it was very tough. Now Hikaru tries to protect the d5 pawn by rook a d8, and now b4. By b4 he's trying to expand on the queen side to somehow make some imbalance, but also he's weakening the c4 square by that move, and other moves don't help as well. Let's say if he goes for b3, trying to somehow use his bishop later on, there's g5, because now g4 is a strong threat, and if he goes back to g2, now g4 goes, knight e1, and now h5 with some potential attack on the king side after king g7, h4, and opening up the h file maybe. Also ideas like knight g5 and e4 are also quite good to just somehow hold the position and block everything. I think that's also quite nice. Yeah, Rapport just tried to make some imbalance, but after queen e6 and b5, now knight goes to a5 and gets to c4 next. Now Rapport took on e5, but it was too late, because now the bishop can never come into play because of the c4 outpost for the knight. Queen h6 by Hikaru, and now you cannot even take on f5 because of knight f2. And if king f2, then a check goes, and black has at least a draw, but I would say this position is quite dangerous for white to play. There's rook f8 with some dangerous attacks on the f file. There's perpetual, which basically means that Rapport is out. So he chose to play bishop g2 here, queen f6 back to protect the f5 pawn, and now a4. But now Hikaru just plays really practical chess, and he takes on d4, takes, and now he plays c5. He's going to play c4 next if white doesn't take en passant, create a passed pawn, and this bishop pair is not useful to white. That's why Rapport takes on c6, queen c6, and now bishop d2. And now after knight c4, these knights are just dominating the position, and the bishop pair is completely useless. We had a couple of more moves: rook dc1, rook c8, bishop e1, now queen e6, and now after rook cb1, Hikaru plays a6 to stop potential a5 move, to meet a5 with b5 and completely blocking the position. And after rook b3, rook c6 to protect the b6 pawn, and after doubling and g5, the draw was agreed, which was kind of weird because Rapport needed a win. Of course, it was not very pleasant to play for a win, but I think in these cases you just try to play, and if you lose, you lose. But you play for the finals of Grand Prix, so it seemed a bit off, but yeah, anyways, it's kind of weird to have that, but I get it. I get that the position is unplayable almost to white, but he has to try some crazy stuff. Black is going to play g5 next and try to completely fix the pawn structure. And the issue for white is that even if he tries to push with f3 to push this knight away, then after knight f6, e4 is virtually impossible because there's so much control over the e4 square. e3 will become quite a weak pawn. And yeah, that's it. By this draw, Hikaru Nakamura qualified for the finals, in which he will meet Levon Aronian. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section and I will get back to you. See you soon and bye.